Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's presentation. This week's topic is personal relationships and communication. My overview of the presentation is that we're going to cover how effective communication applies to personal relationships. We will define personal relationships and we'll look at some guidelines for sustaining healthy personal relationship. We begin with the definition of personal relationships. Personal relationships are a voluntary commitment between irreplaceable individuals. Personal relationships are influenced by rules, relationship dialectics, and surrounding contexts. Now, we meet a lot of people in our world at work, at school, in different activities that we might do, at church, at synagogue, at temple, and lots of places. And now we're meeting a lot of people online as well. A feature of a personal relationship is that it's unique. So you pick out people, it's voluntary and it's unique. So you pick out people you want to spend more time with because there's something that resonates with you where they're not just like other people in those different contexts that you are involved in. Another feature of personal relationship is that there's commitment, there's passion, there's an investment, there are relationship rules that the people create in the relationship, and then relationships are also affected by context. Here's some common relationship rules that my students came up with in some prior classes. Keep confidences, show up in times of need, celebrate each other's success, be honest but kind, and respect boundaries. Now, we had some fun with this. I also had students get into gendered groups. So, first, let's look at the men that got together. They came up with this list. Keep things light and playful, show support through actions, avoid discussing feelings, respect the bro code, and give each other a hard time. So men like to tease each other, and I even see this with boys. They like to give each other a hard time, but they know what the limits are. So this is what the men came up with when they were in their group, and the women came up with this set of rules. Communicate frequently, provide emotional support through tough times, celebrate milestones and life events, and give constructive but gentle and honest feedback. And don't date your friend's ex without checking it out first. Maybe this is what men meant by the bro code. So these are just some rules that students came up with. So I invite you to think about, what are your rules in friendships? Do you talk about the rules? Do they just sort of arise and you don't talk about them until there's a violation and then people get upset and it threatens a relationship? So it's good to think about what the rules are and to articulate them rather than just have them be these vague things that people aren't really sure of. Now, all relationships go through stages of development and they all develop at their own pace. There's some similarities between friendships and romances in the way that they develop, but there's also some differences. And then all relationships have turning points, which is a point at which a relationship either gets deeper or it moves towards ending. So how we think about turning points. Let's look at first the nature of friendships. So with friendships, people are willing to invest. They invest time, they invest their their feelings, and they invest sometimes even resources, right? Um, Another thing that characterizes a friendship is that there's closeness. Now, with women, they tend to express closeness more through dialogue, and with men, it's more through doing joint activities. Some more on the nature of friendship. So, acceptance is really important for friends. We expect our friends to accept us, including whatever flaws we might have. And with friends, we don't want to have to put up a facade. We don't want to put up a fake front. We want to just be able to just be ourselves. And being accepted by others is important to our self-worth. Being rejected by our friends can be a real blow. So we count on them for support, and it can really hurt us when we don't get it. Our third slide talks about trust. So there's two dimensions of trust. There's the confidence that the other person will be dependable, that they'll be there for us when we need them. And we also have to trust that they care about our well-being and our welfare, that they're not just in it for themselves, that they're in it because they do care about us. Now, trust develops in degrees and it happens gradually. It's not automatic. And the level of trust that develops depends on your individual history, your family scripts about what's the appropriate way to go about developing a friendship, and then your willingness to take risks. If you're not willing to take risks, then it's not possible to create friends. And sometimes people who have really high anxiety, that's one of the problems. And it's good to see a counselor if you find that's true for you, that you really have trouble trusting people. Some counselors could help you work through that. The last slide talks about the importance of support. So some of the ways that friends support each other is to listen when your friend has a problem. Just talking it out can help you feel less upset about it. It can also help you think of solutions. Offering your friends help, that's another way to offer support. But again, always ask, don't just assume they want your help. Let friends let friends know that they aren't alone, that we all have hard times and lots of us have similar challenges, and letting people know that they're not alone can be really, really helpful. Being available to our friends is really important. And then there's something called covert intimacy where you're not really upfront about it, but people just know that you're there for them. Now let's look at the development of friendships. So, Bill Rawlings came up with this idea about how friendships develop. And what we find is that we meet people in all different walks of life. So we meet people at work, we meet people at school, we meet people at church or synagogue or temple or at a retreat. We meet people, if we maybe go do yoga or we play on a team. So there's lots of places where we interact with people, but in those interactions, we usually have a specific role, like at work or, at school where you're students, um, and in sports teams, you've got your, position that you're playing and so on, right? So you're not necessarily friends outside those situations. When you start getting friendlier with people in those roles, and in those other situations, then you start moving towards friendship. And it might start with, say, you get together with someone from class because you want to study together, and then you enjoy each other's company, and then you start going out for coffee, and then maybe you decide to catch a movie or, other kinds of activity that you might want to do together. So when you start doing that, engaging in these activities that aren't connected to those roles that you're playing in that other context, then you have what's called a nascent friendship, and that's a word for something that's new. Nascent is new. It's a budding friendship. As you start spending more time together, then the friendship starts to have patterns. You find that there's some predictability in it. You have what's called a stabilized friendship. And then if you're no longer getting your needs met, you're growing apart, maybe you have to move. Maybe you decide to change your lifestyle, like joining AA and quitting drinking, or joining some spiritual group, or deciding to really commit yourself to activism, whatever it is that causes this change, then relationships may start to to start waning. So waning is when you are spending less time together and you're starting to feel that you're not as close. And it often happens gradually, but sometimes it can be abrupt. And and we, you know, we could have good reasons for it, like we have to move, we're taking a new job in another location, we go to school, and so on. But sometimes it happens because we don't feel comfortable with that person anymore. And that happens because our rules that maybe weren't articulated got violated, or we're seeing a change in the person and we don't like the direction that they're going in. When we get to know people, we usually get to know them through layers, right? And a lot of you have seen the movie Shrek, where he says, I'm like an onion because I have layers. Well, that I bet came out of a person who had taken a communication class, because this is a very popular theory of communication that you get to know people through different layers. So in the outer layer is your just basic information like your name, your age, your gender, and things like that. Some of that you can just sort of see looking at people and other things you do engage in conversation. Then we have preferences, so we feel comfortable talking about the food that we like to eat, the music that we like to listen to. We could see the differences in the kinds of clothes, and so we can talk about that stuff, and that's pretty comfortable because that's close to the surface. Then you get a little deeper and you look at your goals and your aspirations. What do you want to do with your life? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? What sort of career do you want? Do you want to have a family? What kind of family do you want? And so on, right? So we get into talking about these things, they get to be more personal and we get a little deeper. And then when people start talking about their religious convictions, then they tend to be a lot closer because people don't generally like to share that. I mean, we don't mind telling people the specific religion we have. I'm Christian, I'm Jewish, I'm Buddhist. But then to really get into what that means, what the convictions are, that usually feels more personal, and you won't really get into that until you know people better. And then getting into your own deeply held fears and fantasies. Like we have to be pretty close to share those kinds of things. And then our self-concept, who we really see ourselves to be, the deeper self. So we tend to get through these later layers over a period of time. Sometimes when people get to know each other online, they go through the stages more quickly, but they may not, they may be missing things about the person. And then when they actually meet them face to face, they're not quite what they thought they were. So we have to be careful about that. But there's something about communicating through the internet that makes things happen pretty quickly. Alrighty. Now, after people have either outgrown the other person, they're going a different direction, or they've just kind of exhausted the possibilities of what positive things they could get out of relationship, or they feel like this person is behaving in a way that they don't appreciate, or they violated a huge rule that they feel is like really significant, then you might be moving towards relationship deterioration. So sometimes there's an abrupt ending, and that's often when there's some rule that a person feels was violated that's unforgivable. More often, relationships start to wane. They gradually start to deteriorate. People start closing down some of the things that they talk about. They start spending less time together, and slowly it's just less and less and less, and then you realize that the relationship's over. That's more typical for how friendships end, and people will often come up with reasons or excuses why they can't spend time together. With the serious violation, though, it's typically abrupt, and sadly, sometimes people could have talked about it and maybe found some resolution, but with friends, there's sometimes less commitment to trying to work out a serious issue than there is when people are dating or married and so on. Alrighty, so we looked at friendship deterioration as well as development, and now we're going to look at what some of the pressures are in friendships. Now, there's one set of tensions that are called the internal tensions, and these consist of relational dialectics, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then there's also diverse communication styles. So the way that you communicate is culturally based, but it's also a result of your family and your community. And there can be tensions if there's different ways of communicating, not only verbally, but non-verbally. And then also sexual attraction can create tensions. Now, if the sexual attraction is mutual, then the tension will probably just lead to people just, engaging in a sexual relationship. But it's when the attraction isn't mutual that it tends to create a problem. Or if the attraction is in a workplace where there's rules about not dating and so on, it can be a problem. So all of these are tensions. Then you have the external pressures, and these could be your competing demands. So you might not be able to spend as much time with somebody because you have to work and go to school and maybe help out with your family and other kinds of responsibilities. And sometimes there's pressures because of personal changes, and you might decide you want to spend your time differently. And then geographic distance puts pressures on to relationships. And sometimes it's really hard to maintain a relationship over a long distance. It is easier to do that today than it used to be because of the internet, and we can have video conferencing, communicate with people online. People are using texts a lot more frequently and email, right? So we can talk to people a lot more easily at a long distance. So it's not as common for friendships to end, but there's a kind of satisfaction you get with actually spending time face to face in the same location with people. And so people can get frustrated when that's not happening, and then they might move, they might become more distant because they're not able to spend that time together. The kinds of relations where people stay friends seems like forever and ever because they have so much in common and similar values, and maybe because of a lot of history. We call those friends of the heart. And then people that we're friends with for a shorter time for specific reasons or specific activities, we would call friends of the road. That doesn't mean that they're less significant. We accumulate through our life journey a lot of friends of the road, but we often stop seeing them when we stop engaging in those activities that brought us together. Now, here's those relationship dialectics that I told you I'd spend more time on. So, a relationship dialectic is a set of oppositional poles, and we all have them. Um, Montgomery and Baxter were the researchers that came up with this theory, and they did research on thousands of people. They did surveys, and they found out that people all over the world feel these tensions. So the first tension is one between autonomy and connection. And you might have noticed this, right? You really want to spend time with your friends, but then you need to be alone. And this happens also even with dating. Like you really want to be with that person, but you also need your alone time. And it can feel like a tension when you want the alone time while the other person wants the connection and vice versa. Then there's the predictability versus novelty tension. So we like predictability. We like to know that someone is going to be there for us. And we also like to have predictable activities like movie night, or the night where you get meals together, or a night where you do some sports together, right? So we like that predictability to know what to expect in our lives and what to expect to our friends, but then we can get bored and we want something new. So we want novelty. And it's great to alternate that. Like some people have a pattern of like they always go to the movies when they hang out, but then one of their friends might say, "Hey, why don't we go bowling or why don't we go to karaoke or do something different." And the other person might feel disappointed because they were used to the pattern and they were counting on it. So it's something that you have to negotiate with people that wanting to change things up, and have new experiences as well as having that predictability. And then the last dialectic is openness versus closeness. So, um, some people are extremely open about all sorts of things and feelings and what what's what other people view as very, very personal. And other people are closed. We all have some things that we want to keep to ourselves and not share. And sometimes we could feel a real tension of wanting to share something, but feeling like we shouldn't. And sometimes we can have tensions with our friends because they want us to share more than we're comfortable with, or we want them to share more than they're comfortable with sharing. So these are the types of tensions, right? So you have three sets of dialectics, and all people experiencing them, and all people have to manage them. So there are specific strategies for managing them. And this is the grid that shows the four different strategies. So one strategy that you see in the left quadrant, left top quadrant, is what's called neutralization. And this is when you try to find a balance or a compromise between these dialectical poles. So, for example, if you finding like you want to you're having a tension between the autonomy and the connection. So you talk to a friend about it, and you have certain nights where you decide you will spend time, and then certain nights where you're not gonna spend time together, and you make that really clear. So you compromise between these two things. Then there's something called separation, which you can do in some situations. And that's when you will assign one part of the dialectic to certain activities or certain spheres, and then the other part of the dialectic to the other. So the best example I have of that are a couple that were my professors. They both taught in my PhD program, and um, they had made an agreement that they would maintain their individual identities at work so people didn't just see them as a unit. So they always were away from each other at work. They didn't have lunch, they didn't have coffee, they didn't go into each other's offices. They just gave each other total space at work, and they never even sat together at meetings because they didn't want people to think that they um, thought the same way or that they were a coalition. Um, but when they were at home, it would be a totally different thing. So sometimes I would be invited to their house, or they had parties and things. When you're in grad school, you sometimes have closer relationships with your professors than when you're an undergrad. So when they were at home at parties, they'd be very affectionate. They would be be sit together. They didn't have those same rules about being apart. So that's how they tried to make sure that they could have their autonomy and their connection by allotting them to the different spheres of their life. Segmentation is when you try to you meet one of the needs of the dialectic, and you ignore the other one and you don't satisfy it. I see this most often with new couples. They totally ignore their need for alone time because they want to be with that person so much, and they spend so much time together that they can get burnt out. And then the person who wants to be alone may feel guilty or feel like it's difficult, or they may even get angry because the other person doesn't want to be away from them. So it can lead to some conflict when people do sacrifice one end for the other end. So, but that is a strategy that some people do, is just ignore one side of the dialectic. The last is reframing, where you recognize that you have these opposite poles, but don't view them as a conflict, but view them as a way to sort of enrich your life and enrich your relationship. So we can take the um, the need for predictability versus stability. And you could say that, you do the stabilizing to maintain the relationship. And so you have some like regular routines or some rituals and so on, but you change it up so that you can meet that other need. And then you view that changing it up as not threatening the stability, but actually strengthening the stability, because you know that if you're able to also have some novelty and do some new fun things, it creates a more excitement, and then it'll bring those positive feelings to your relationship when you're doing more of the predictable activities together. So that's the managing the dialectical tensions strategies that can be used. The next slide is looking at communication styles and how we can have these different styles. And sometimes it's easier to connect to people who have a similar style, but it's also true that people who have different styles can generate some interest and excitement in our life. So it can be a good thing to also have uh, people with different styles in your life. But these are four of some common styles of communicating. And the first is the person called the relator, who's very warm and friendly, but kind of slow to open up. They will share feelings and be a good listener, but you um, will find that and that they're also very cooperative, but their interaction is slower, and they're not real speedy. Okay. Um, the socializer, on the other hand, is also really relationship oriented, and relationships are really important to them. They have strong feelings of personal worth, so they have good self-esteem, and they relate to people easily. They have very fast-paced kinds of conversations. They're enthusiastic and persuasive, and they're not afraid of risk taking. So they're people who are very dynamic in the way that they communicate. So both of those styles, the relator and the socializer, they like to have open relationships and share a lot, and relationships are really, really important to them. Now, on the bottom of this grid, you have the two quadrants where people have more reserved relationships. The thinker, who's in the left-hand bottom quadrant, is an efficient perfectionist. They're slow and cautious. They're very task-oriented. They like to follow directions, and they work well alone. So they're reserved. They're not going to open up and tell you a lot of personal things, and they're slower to interact. They're slower to come up with things to say when you have conversations with them. The director, on the other hand, is very fast-paced. So they have an emphasis on results. So the directors are very goal-oriented people. They have little concern for relationships because they're more interested in accomplishing their goals. They're not likely to share their feelings. They may be seen by others as dominating, and they are very fast-paced and decisive. So these are different styles of communicating that you might find, and you'll probably gravitate towards the people you feel most comfortable with. But it's good to know that there's these different styles, and sometimes when you feel uncomfortable, it could be because of a style that you're not used to, or just a style that doesn't feel comfortable to you because you prefer to interact the other way. If you really prefer being open, you might not feel comfortable with people that are more reserved and closed and don't want to share as much. So communication style differences can cause tensions in relationships. Um, there's also style differences based on culture, and it can be exciting to interact with people from different cultures with different communication styles, but it can also cause some stress because we do feel uncomfortable when we aren't able to predict how people are going to interact, and that's sometimes how it feels. Right, moving along then. So now I just want to state some guidelines for communication that are from Julia Wood's textbook. And she talks about engaging in dual perspective. So when your friend acts and you perceive what they're doing, if you remember back from the perception module that we did earlier in the semester, we know none of us have perfect perception. We all have selective perception. And remember that when you're perceiving a situation that maybe doesn't feel right to you, and do what's called perception checking. So remember that you're interpreting and evaluating and assigning meaning to things, which could be different than the way another person does. So you do want to communicate honestly, but also be open to hearing how the other person's experiencing it. And there could be another explanation for what you're seeing. And by being able to express yourself honestly, you can grow from discussing differences. And also, Julia Wood says, don't sweat the small stuff. Some people get so upset about every little thing, and that can be very, very stressful on relationships. So try to be uh, more willing to accept slight differences or small problems and keep things in perspective. Now, I have some guidelines that I like to tell students, and I teach conflict management, and I've been a mediator, and I've helped people resolve conflicts, and I also used to train mediators for an organization. Here's some things that I've seen. When you perceive a problematic behavior, then first do a perception check. Ask questions and put out your perceptions in the most non-judgmental language that you can. Try to say things in a neutral way about what you're observing, and then ask for feedback on that and see if the person is experiencing or perceiving it the same way. Maybe there's a difference and you talk through it and you can have some understanding. And another thing to do if you know you're going to have that you're in a conflict with someone and you want to try to work it out is to state your positive intentions to preserve the relationship. Like the reason you want to talk about this issue or this concern is because you value the relationship. People are often threatened by conversations about conflict. The the preferred mode is to use avoidance, which usually just makes things worse. So when you want to engage in trying to resolve a conflict, you can talk about how important the relationship is to you and how you really want to have this conversation so that you can keep your positive relationship going. And then when you do start talking about whatever is bothering you, then use I statements and talk about your feelings, talk about the catalyst that generated the feelings, and then ask for feedback on what you're observing, because maybe what you're observing is not what the other person is experiencing. So you want to have a two-way conversation on that. Um, Use your active listening to get their perspective and understand what their feelings are and acknowledge their reality, even if it's different from yours. We all have different perceptions and experiences, so it's very possible that what you're experiencing is completely different from what the other person is experiencing. So just acknowledge it. It doesn't mean that you're wrong. It means that we're just different. And as you're trying to talk through an issue or problem, look for your common ground and really highlight it. Look at those, whatever it is that you have in common, and focus on that. Then you can brainstorm different ideas to meet both sets of needs, and then wait till you fully understand both perspectives before you jump to the solutions. So this is in a nutshell what I spend a whole semester teaching people how to do. So if you really want to get more understanding and more depth on how to resolve conflicts, I highly recommend you take Communication 340, which is conflict management and mediation. I teach it a lot, but I don't always teach it. And so other people teach it in our department, and it's a great class, a really great class. Alrighty, now we're going to talk a little bit about romantic relationships. So, romantic relationships also follow an evolutionary path. They have three broad stages, which are escalating, so that's when things get more intense. Then navigating, which is just trying to move together in the relationship in a balanced kind of way. And then when things don't work out, you have relationship deterioration. So relationships deteriorate. Um, Online relationships tend to form more rapidly, and that's partly, I think, because of how the disclosure that the going through the onion, the go through the stages of relationship development more quickly, because we can get through that onion more quickly because the online format seems to lend itself to that. Now, some of the influences on attraction. So, uh, proximity is important. If you don't see people, then you can't be attracted to them. We are able to connect with people through space, and sometimes that's satisfying for people, and that's enough. Some people have relationships, romantic and non-romantic, online. But typically, romantic relationships, people do want to spend time together and have physical intimacy. So, being close to a person can be a factor. And sometimes people do manage long distance relationships, but they're pretty stressful compared to being close in close proximity. And sometimes people too get tired of it. Um, People are also attracted to people who are similar to them. Some of the ways in which similarities are important are in values and interests. And although there's an expression that opposites attract, it's actually a lot harder to develop and maintain relationships with when there's a lot of differences. I mean, some differences are easier to manage, but when it's extreme differences, it can be really, really challenging. So that's why you have the matching hypothesis, and people do try to find people that have similar interests, similar values. Even on levels of attractiveness, people feel like they have a better chance with dating when people are similar in their level of attractiveness and whatever the culture tells them attractiveness is, because that does differ across different cultures. Um, People even seem to gravitate towards people who are in um, similar economic standing. Can be difficult otherwise, but it's not always the case. But you do find that that's true quite a bit. And part of that's because whatever interests that you might have, um, if you, for example, if you like golf, that takes a lot more money to play golf than it does to go play tennis in a public court. And tennis is seen as costing more money than, say, playing basketball, which everybody learns in school. Not everyone learns to play tennis, and tennis lessons can be expensive, even though group tennis lessons are cheaper. It can be expensive. So, your income or your parents' income helps to shape the kinds of things that you're interested in because what you have access to is what you can afford. So that's another reason why people are attracted to people who are similar to them because their interests, um, to be able to spend time with people following your interests, you have to be able to afford whatever those interests are. Alrighty. Um, This is another theory about the evolution and the de-evolution of relationships. So I'll just talk through this one. So in the beginning of relationships, you have what's called the invitational stage, where people invite each other to communicate, invite each other to do stuff together. And if the answer is yes, I would like to do that with you, then you move into the exploration stage where people are getting to know each other, exploring their interests, their values, and so on, right? And getting to know each other. Um, if it keeps moving in a positive direction for both parties, they are enjoying spending time together, then it intensifies. And people get more intimate and they get closer. And people will have conflicts, and all relationships have conflicts. That's just a normal, natural process. If people are able to make revisions and negotiate their differences, then you will move to the stage of intimate bonding. And then you can keep navigating that intimate bonding for as long as the relationship is satisfactory. When the relationship is unsatisfactory to one or both parties, then people will start to have conversations in their head about it. So that's called the intrapsychic phase. So as we're moving from the left-hand column to the right-hand column, we're moving from the stages of developing relationship to now we're moving over to the undoing of relationships. So intrapsychic is when people are just talking to themselves about, wow, I didn't like that, or that was not cool, or oh, I think I need a break here, you know? So people just have these internal dialogues and they're called intrapsychic. Then when people start moving to expressing it to other people, they could be telling the other person that they're in the relationship with that they're having these issues and they're having second thoughts about the relationship. Um, they may also talk to other people about it and get more clarity about wanting to break up. And so breaking up is hard. Even the people who initiate breakups have a hard time with it, even if they won't admit it to you. It's most often the case that it's a challenge for people. And so when people are breaking up, it's good to get social support, and most people do. So there's all kinds of social support. It could be from friends. You can go see counselors. You can join support groups and things like that. Now, once the breakup is an actual fact that, wow, this relationship's over, then each of the parties in the relationship will explain the breakup in their own way. We call that the grave dressing. So we have this dead relationship, and what you put over that grave is how people are viewing the reasons for the breakup. And they're often different. Each party has their own story about why the relationship ended. It could be because, some people will be generous and say, oh, we just grew apart, and other people will blame the other person. Um, Once people get over the relationship ending, because it is usually a sad thing to have a relationship end, once people get over it, get through the grief period, then you have resurrection, and that's the stage where you feel good about yourself, you've resolved the fact that that relationship is over, and you are ready for new adventures in life, whether it's um, trying new things, finding new friends, or starting a new relationship. So that's the evolution. It's actually the evolution and the de-evolution of romantic relationships. Now, all romantic relationships uh, involve people developing patterns of interacting, and those patterns of interaction then are their relationship culture. It forms the nucleus of an intimate relationship, and it develops over time. So you'll start having patterns like how you have meals together, how you want to celebrate holidays together, um, how you go to parties together and show up around other people, right? All of these different patterns that people have are really important and they define the relationship. So they develop over time and they evolve throughout the life of a relationship. So as you grow and change, the relationship will also grow and change. If it doesn't, then probably you will end the relationship. So that's relationship culture. And relationship deterioration, as I said, it starts with the intrapsychic processes. And one of the things that can cause a relationship to end is jealousy. And there can be differing responses to jealousy. Some people feel hurt, some people feel angry, but it's it's a major cause of breakups. And people can even be jealous of you spending too much time at work or spend too much time with your friends. It doesn't even have to be they're jealous of you potentially being interested in another person, right? So it's a problem that needs to be dealt with or relationships can end. And then relationship deterioration happens just because of a breakdown of the established patterns. Uh, Mutual understandings are not happening anymore, and also when rules are being violated. So, um, as people feel less invested in a relationship, they may be breaking the patterns more and more, and that, escalates the ending of the relationship. Now we move to digital media and personal relationships. So, social media has made it easier to form and maintain both friendships and romantic relationships. And social media has also made it increasingly easier to misrepresent who you are online. So even though it makes it easier to meet people because you can just be home and just get online and start meeting people, social media also makes it easier for people to misrepresent themselves. So that's a problem because we don't know what the person is really like until we meet them in person. And some people can be perfectly honest and it's not a problem, but because we know that some people don't, we have to be really careful about it. And another problem that happens online is cyber stalking. So just as people get stalked in person, people following you around after work and following you to your house and so on. So cyber stalking is when people are stalking what you're doing online and following your social media and then just trying to learn as much as they can about you. And it's not, um, it's not something that's easy to stop. And it has emerged as a concern because sometimes the people can turn out to be intending some harm or imposing themselves into your life in ways that you're not interested in. So those are some of the problems that happen. So we have it as a tool to connect with people more easily, but then there's a problem with people being dishonest and having nefarious kinds of motives that can happen online as well. So we have to be very careful with online communication for developing personal relationships. Some guidelines for romantic relationship are to adapt your communication to manage distance if you have a distance relationship, and then for there to be satisfaction in the relationship, it's really important that people feel like there's equity. So equity is in terms of investments, investments of time and also psychological responsibility and even things like housework. If people believe that the amount of housework being done by the other person isn't equal to what they're doing, it leads to great dissatisfaction, and it has been a reason why people end relationships is this lack of equity. And then also social, psychological responsibility, so that could be for the relationship, and as well as taking care of your own emotions and not feeling like the other person has to always make you feel better when you don't feel well. It's taking responsibility for your own emotional state. Um, Now, intimate violence is a serious problem and it's extremely widespread. So I have made available for you a very good TED Talk by a person who actually experienced partner violence. And there's a separate quiz on that alone. So I'm not going to talk about it here in this presentation, but definitely want to avoid violence and you want to avoid people who are trying to control you or put you down. If you find that people are putting you down or trying to control you, and you are not ready to end a relationship where that's happening, I highly recommend you speak to a counselor because that is not okay. And then it's also really important to insist on safe sex. Um, I think that you getting this message from other places, and I know that, consent is really important and talked about when you come to our college. That's a topic that you get introduced to. But safe sex is really important as well. And uh, although most people recognize it when they're sober, the problem will often happen when there's substances involved, that people have fewer inhibitions, and also they feel they feel a lot braver. And then another reason why people don't engage in safe sex is because they feel uncomfortable talking about it. People will feel more comfortable just jumping into having sex than having a conversation about it. So that's a problem. So communication is really, really important, to assure yourselves that you are having safe sex. And if a person refuses to talk about it, I would say that's a red flag, right? So it's important to have these conversations. In sum, what I've talked about in this presentation is some basic ideas about personal relationships, what constitutes them, and communication in them, some evolutionary paths of friendships and romantic relationships, and some guidelines for having satisfying friendships and romantic relationships.